Today on Escape the Clock, we're aiming to answer the question, how do you own rental property so that it stays passive income and never becomes a second job? This past January, the average rental unit in the United States sat on the market for 41 days before leasing. That's the longest stretch since tracking began in 2019. And across the cities and states tracked by Princeton's eviction lab, home to roughly 1 in 3 American renters, landlords filed one eviction case for every 13 renter households in 2025. That's 6 weeks of silence, then a tenant that you'd have to take to court. That's not financial freedom. That is a second job with worse hours. Because a rental property is not just an asset, it's an operation. And somebody has to make it rent ready, market it, screen the applicants, answer the 2 a.m. phone calls when the water heater dies, and hold the line when the lease gets tested. The spreadsheet doesn't do any of that. So who should be running the operation? And how do you know that they're any good? Well, today's guests learned the answer from the inside. Cameron started as an engineer at BP, watched his floor shrink from 120 people to 30 in a matter of weeks, and noticed the only calm people left in the building were the old-timers quietly collecting rent checks. He bought his first rental in 2014, managed his own doors, made his own mistakes, and by 2018 had built a portfolio big enough to launch Emerson Property Management in Houston, where his team now manages over 300 properties for investors while he owns more than 30 of his own. So today, we get into what a property manager actually does across the full life of a lease, where landlords really lose money, how to interview a manager before you hand them your biggest asset, and the red flags that separate professionals from a business card and a hammer. Plus, the 7-figure lesson that Cameron himself learned by chasing cash flow and ignoring appreciation. So stay tuned for my conversation with Cameron Tope and learn how to make your rentals work for you instead of the other way around. Welcome back to Escape the Clock, the show where we highlight strategies and approaches for achieving financial freedom and having the option not to work. I'm your host, Daniel C. Rogers. Real estate is one of the most popular vehicles for financial freedom. Single-family rentals, in particular, have become the asset of choice for an entire generation of would-be retirees. And the blueprint is well understood. Buy a property, rent it out, use the cash flow to slowly replace your salary. Eventually, retire on the rents. And the math on paper works. Single-family rental yields average around 7.5% annually across the country, and 67% of landlords now own at least one single-family rental. But the math on paper and the math in real life are not the same thing, and nowhere is that gap wider than in the operational side of owning rentals, the part most investors completely underestimate before buying their first property. Most new landlords assume the choice is binary. Either you self-manage and save the fee, or you hire a property manager and lose 8 to 12% of your rental income. What rarely gets discussed is that a great property manager often pays for themselves several times over through lower vacancy, better tenant selection, faster maintenance resolution, and the avoidance of catastrophic mistakes that can wipe out a year of cash flow in a single eviction. But the reverse can also be true. A bad property manager can quietly destroy the economics of your investment without you even knowing it's happening. Inflated maintenance bills, slow leasing, poor tenant screening, unreturned phone calls. The fees they charge are not the actual cost of hiring, the damage they do is. And today's guest sees this every single day from inside the industry. And he sees it from a perspective most operators do not have. He owns rentals himself. More importantly, he runs the management business. And he has a clear view of who succeeds in this asset class and who quietly burns out. Cameron Tope is the founder and broker of Emerson Property Management in Houston, where his team manages over 300 properties for investors across the greater Houston area. Cameron started in the oil and gas industry as an engineer at BP, watched the layoffs happen around him, and then pivoted into real estate in 2014 to build something he actually controlled. And by 2018, he had built a personal portfolio large enough that he founded Emerson to bring professional discipline to a fragmented industry. Today, he owns over 30 rental properties himself, and he's been featured speaking on BRRR investing and strategies, and has a publicly tracked operational record that most property managers would not want to compete against, including a tenant eviction rate of a meager 0.87% versus the Houston average of 9%. Cameron, welcome to Escape the Clock.
Daniel, thanks for having me on, man. That was a great intro.
I know you didn't start out in real estate. You started out in oil and gas, and where you were working as a development well site leader and intervention engineer at BP. And I would love to hear more about that and the pivot that took place. What were you seeing at BP that made you decide that rental property was the answer for you?
Yeah, it was more around as soon as I got in. This was 2013 when I graduated and moved to Houston. And it was probably within 6 months, I noticed that, well, everybody noticed that oil went from like 120 to 30 in a very, very short amount of time. I mean, we're talking just a few months or maybe even a few weeks. And so I had $30,000, $40,000 of student loans. I had just started work and I was nervous. I was like, layoffs are happening. I'm thinking I'm getting with BP, a huge company, and I'm going to be protected and, get a good income and then pay off my loans, and, thought BP was a safe option. Well, I was freaking out, but there were these old timers, guys in their late 40s, 50s, 60s who were just Joe Cool. They were not stressed at all, feet up on the desk. And so I was like, okay, give me the secret, y'all. Tell me what's going on here. And they had said that a lot of them owned 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 rental properties. And they had just paid them off over time. And so they didn't really care. They were making $10,000, $15,000 a month off these places. And so if they lost their job, they're like, oh, wait. Oil and gas is very cyclical. So they're like, we'll just take the layoff money, let our rental properties pay for our lifestyle. And then when the economy comes back up and oil prices come back up, we'll jump back in and make our 6-figure salary. So that was really where I was like, ooh, okay, there's something there. And that's when I started diving in and saying, okay, how do I do this?
Yeah. Even when I worked at Google, I noticed there were people who were doing this as well. And you would think, oh, you're making enough salary, you're working at Google, you wouldn't need to do this. But it's pretty broad, how many folks move into this. So there are actually nearly 20 million rental properties with almost 50 million units in the United States. And 51% of rental property owners use a property manager. And the industry itself has generated $134 billion in revenue in 2025, with 84% of that coming from residential management. Yet when I talk to people, most first-time landlords, at least, they don't really understand what property managers do. So I like to kind of start actually at the basics for folks in case they're just not completely aware. Maybe they've never even heard of property managers. I don't know. But can you walk me through the full scope of what most owners don't realize that they might be signing up for, why they should even be considering a property manager?
Yeah, that's a good place to start foundation. And unfortunately, unlike a barrel of oil that everybody understands and has metrics for and the chemistry of, property management isn't a one size fits all. There are people that just do maintenance, that just do leasing, that kind of that specialize in certain aspects of property management. So if you don't have a property manager, you are the property manager. That's first and foremost. But the basics would be, I kind of look at this as a life cycle. So at the beginning, you have your rental property, it's vacant. Maybe you've moved out of it, whatever the reason is, you just bought it, it is vacant. So fixing that property up, getting it to what we call rent ready standards to make sure it's marketable. That's step one. Then getting it marketed and listed for a tenant and sharing that across usually the MLS. Some people do, marketplace or what have you, but marketing that property, then screening the tenant, making sure that we're keeping that super low eviction rate. And as you said early on in the show, one major incident, $1, $5, $10, $15,000 mistake can wipe out a year or multiple years of cash flow. So it's how do we prevent those big risky things? You want to still be in the game. The people that hold the assets longest win. If you can prevent those couple things that could come up that really knock you out of the game, that's a huge piece of this. And then once you screen the tenant, getting that tenant into the property. And then from there, it's usually tenant relations, making sure that that tenant feels safe, that the property is safe for the tenant. They have a good relationship with somebody that's either you or your property manager. And then handling any maintenance and repairs, making sure that's timely. That's the number one reason across national data why tenants leave is lack of attention to maintenance. So make sure you're responsive to maintenance and that asset is taken care of. And then when that tenant does decide to leave, which hopefully that's multiple years down the road, then you help facilitate that move out process, line everything up to repeat that process over again, with also making sure that you handle the security deposit, which is the most litigious part of real estate.
Yeah, the success metric seems kind of clear to me here. It's tenant satisfaction, right? Like if the tenant's happy, then the cash flow will happen and probably less incidents and abuse and problems that you have to deal with. I am curious for someone who is learning about this and is like, okay, I'm about to buy or start renting out my first property. They don't have a scale problem yet. Do you usually advise that they should at least do it themselves for a while to kind of get a feel for it? Or do you think, no, like this just makes the ROI so high, you should just jump right in? What would you typically advise there?
I think it depends on the individual. So if you have somebody at Google, making $150, maybe $200,000 a year and above, I would probably just hire it out from the beginning because your time is so much more valuable and your hourly rate that you're getting paid is spent better on focusing on your job, maybe focusing on a bonus, career progression. But if you're 22, 23 years old and just starting out and maybe you're, working a blue collar job or some lower paying job and you're like, okay, I'm capped out at where I can in my career and this is another way to generate revenue, then definitely. And you have the time, maybe you don't have a family or have a lot of responsibilities yet. So that's going to be the big thing because it does take some time to get up to speed. I mean, technology now and the amount of information that we can get is unlike any other time in history. So you can get it, but unfortunately, there's a lot of bad and conflicting information too. What works in Houston for our portfolio might not work in Seattle, might not work in New York, might not work in Miami. So you just have to be mindful that there is a lot of information and being able to distill that and having the capacity to do it. So I really think it depends on your situation and how much time you want to spend on that. But all things being equal, if you have the time, I do think it does behoove you to get in there and see, because then when you hire it out, you have some basis for what you're looking for.
What type of expectations should people have, though, about hiring a property manager? Can it be 100% full service white glove where the property manager will literally do everything for them? Or should they have their expectations ticked back a little bit and understand there's certain things out of scope for a property manager? You're going to have to be involved on those kinds of items.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to depend upon what you're looking for. So when I first started, I was doing it all. I was like, I can figure this out. I was 23 years old, full of it. And I was ready to go. But then I'm like, okay, leasing is taking a lot of my time. So I hired a lease agent and she would help me screen the tenants and get those 100 phone calls I was getting, screen through those, respond quickly and get the property leased. Outside of getting a desirable property that attracts good tenants, tenant relations is number one. But there's so many different folks in the business. You have the lease agents, you have people, then you go on to find a vendor and maybe that vendor helps you with the maintenance stuff. So you've got kind of your team, but you could go full service. We are full service and have that one contact, that property manager that has all these folks. And unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, there's just no standardization across the industry. Some states require licensing for property management. In Texas, we do have to be licensed agents. In some states, there's no licensing. So a dude in a truck with a hammer can go be your property manager. Like we do white glove because I think that's best. I'm kind of a control freak, Daniel, where I like to have entire control of the situation. And like you said, there's these little aspects that come up that could really be detrimental to the asset. And we want to make sure we can control that conversation with the tenant. We can control some of the repairs and speed of that. And I think it just really depends on what you're looking for. Are you looking for, an assistant? Maybe that's when you go out and hire the lease agent and a good handyman. Or are you looking for somebody to partner with that has all the experience that can really take this asset and maximize the value?
Yeah, I think it probably really comes down to being honest about your strengths and your weaknesses, your time availability, things like that. Like if you know you're not going to be good at returning a phone call, maybe you're not the best person to be the first point of contact. And real costs been measured with this. There was a eviction cost analysis that was ran between 2024 and 2025 that showed that the average tenant turnover actually costs a landlord between $2,500 and almost $4,000 per event. That includes things like the lost in rent during vacancies and repairs, marketing, admin time, all kinds of stuff. So a single eviction costs significantly more. It can range between $3,500 and $10,000 once you put in like maybe legal fees and court costs and the lost rent that you're getting for 2 to 3 months, just dealing with all of that. So, landlords can really pay out of pocket and really get hurt here if they're not careful. So I'm kind of hoping you can walk us through how a good property manager is actually making money for the owner and actually giving some peace of mind.
Yeah, no, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. The eviction's probably number one. When I first started, I told myself, I said, there is no way I'm going to allow eviction. I'm doing the screening. I will look in that tenant's car. I'll go to their old residence and peek in the window. Like I'll do everything I can. And I will 100% ensure that I never have to go through an eviction. I've gone through, I don't even know how many, right? And, we'll go through a couple dozen a year just across the portfolio. And most of those, we did a study too a couple years ago, 93.5% of all of our evictions that we facilitate are owner-placed tenants.
Wow.
So over 9 out of 10 evictions that we do are all owner placed. And that's because they might not have the technology. We have the fraud prevention. We have all these other tools. And again, we leverage technology. Some of these tools aren't available to the mom and pop landlord because it might be a $50 or $100 or $150 a month just for the software. And it doesn't make sense for one property, but we can disseminate that expense across 300, 400, however many doors we have. So I think in the beginning, it's the tenant selection and tenant screening is one way that property managers are worth their weight or not. The second piece is also organization. So something that we have to educate a lot of our owners on, Daniel, is around a property sitting vacant is losing money. On average, depending upon where you're at, it's about $100 a day. Obviously, in the Seattle area or maybe areas of California, New York, it's going to be more than that because the rents are so high. But in Houston, our rents average a little under $2,000 a month. So it's about $100 a month that you're losing, and you have utilities you're paying, and you have lawn care. Maybe you have pool expenses. You have the risk of somebody breaking into your property. And so an owner's sitting there going, well, I moved out of this property a month ago, and I'm really trying to evaluate my options. And I'm thinking, you've already lost $2,000. You've already lost $2,500. So you going through and trying to find that contractor, making sure the property is up to property code, Texas property code. So you've got to have keyless deadbolts. You've got to have smoke detectors in all the bedrooms. I mean, those are things that we do every time. And when we make sure when a tenant moves out, it's lined up for that day or the next day. So we have this stuff happen in sequence. And our KPI is to have that property turned over in 10 days. So from the time the tenant moves out, if they move out at the end of the month, that property is marketed on the 10th of the month, online, ready to show. And sometimes we have at least before we're even done with the make ready. But that speed and then the tenant selection, I think, are the biggest two. The other one, Daniel, I would say is maintenance. Some of our guys, we pay $500,000 to $1 million a year in maintenance and repair costs. So they give us preferential treatment. I can get guys out there in no time, and attention to maintenance is the biggest reason tenants leave. That's the other thing is, if you want to be out on vacation, no problem, but who's going to answer the phone? And unfortunately, I don't know why, but hot water heaters like to go out at between midnight and 4 a.m. So,
yeah, right.
Yeah.
I love that you have that 10-day turnover. That's awesome. I could share a little bit about kind of my experiences so far with my first rental property, because tenant selection was the most challenging part, I thought. Just finding people that would pay the rate that you're looking for to get the cash flow you want, who would be reliable. Because I'm renting in a college town. So I'm getting people with no credit or horrible credit, right? And so that I have to take a risk with some of that. And I did notice that because I'm deciding to try to manage it myself right now, that, yeah, you'll get random calls on all kinds of stuff. And the first call I got was that the oven didn't work. Well, I'd paid for an inspection. Everything was great. I was just shocked. I was scratching my head. I'm like, okay, well, the oven's not that old. I was going to get ready to get in the car and drive 3 hours to go out there and just inspect it. And I said, well, okay, slow down. So I asked him, like, can you just check a few things for me? Send me a photo of, see if there's like an error code, this and that, and a couple things. And turned out it wasn't plugged in all the way. So, little things happen, but we had that resolved in minutes, right? And that was going to cost me hours of time and all of this money. So a property manager could have resolved that. It might never even come onto my radar, maybe, because, that was such a small thing they could have dealt with it. So I know, like you said, weight in gold. And, this is a real business. There's 304,000 property management business in the United States. 238,000 of those are focused on residential. And so it can be a little fragmented in how they're operated. There is a bit of sometimes a reputation issue with some property managers. I'm kind of curious if you know where that's coming from. And I'd love to get into how you would advise someone to think about finding a good property manager. There's probably things you should be doing. You're interviewing them. They're working with you. They're a partner. Like, how should you approach that partnership, and how do you know it's working?
I want to touch on the oven piece before we get into that. Statistically, last year, we canceled about 1/3 of all work orders. So tenants put in all sorts of stuff. I've seen, hey, we've got an anthill in the backyard. Can you come fix that? I plugged in my toaster oven. Can you guys, what's going on? The lights are out. So we have all this where we have somebody who's dedicated to maintenance. And when that request comes in, we already have the 2 dozen items that come up all the time. And it's like, okay, did you go hit the breaker? Did you hit the reset button on the garbage disposal? Did did you, the AC's acting up. Have you changed the filter? So we walk through and we do all that at no expense to the owners. Some people might charge for that, but we handle that and then we cancel it. Or maybe it's a cosmetic thing. It's something like, hey, there's a nick in the drywall. Hey, we'll handle that later. That's cosmetic. We're not going to deal with that now. We're going to kick that expense to the term. And obviously we would never kick a super cataclysmic thing that could get worse to the term, but cosmetic stuff will move down the line. So I think that's another thing that a property manager or somebody sophisticated who's handling your maintenance can deal with. You would never, our owners have no idea that the tenant asked them to come out and try to resolve an anthill or kill a cockroach or whatever it is. And then to go on to the other piece that you mentioned, so finding a good property manager, I put a guide together many, many years ago about the 26 questions you should ask a property manager. And I think, and that's a free resource. You guys can go on our website, emersonpropertymanagement.com, and download it. But even if you're going to go through all those questions and ask, I think a couple big things are get their experience level. I thought I knew property management when I started because I was managing my own doors. I was my own property manager. And I realized I knew very little. And I talk about this a lot, Daniel, is property management and real estate, residential real estate specifically, has a long feedback loop. So I know when I bake a cake in 1 hour, it's going to taste good or not. I've made a mistake on the ingredients and I've screwed up. But if I screened a tenant and I don't hear from them, I think, man, I'm so smart. I've done everything. It's great. And then 6 months later, you go to do an inspection, or maybe you don't do an inspection until they move out. And it looks like a crack house. It looks like there's been 30 people living in there. So all the while, you think you've done a great job. It's really until those moments come up like, hey, we're calling an attorney because there's mold in here. Hey, you guys didn't respond to this in a timely manner. Did you guys rekey the property when I moved in? In Texas, and I assume this is in most states, but you have to rekey a property within 7 or 10 days, or the tenant is allowed out of their lease with no expenses or charges to them. So that's something that when owners ask us, well, that sounds like an expense, but there's a reason and a method to the madness. So getting that experience level checking, I would recommend at least 10 years in the industry just because they've gone through and understood the mistakes that they've made. And then how do you jive with them? Is it one of those companies that you're talking to somebody in another state? Is this a large national company? Just me, maybe some of my bias, but some of the large national companies that operate in multiple cities, they kind of have a split focus. And we've seen a lot of PE getting into real estate because with AI coming in, everybody still needs a place to live. So all that private equity is coming in and buying up property management companies in droves. So then you're sitting there, you had a relationship, Daniel, you and I have a relationship, and then all of a sudden I'm like, hey, I'm out. Good luck. You're dealing with this private equity group. And I haven't heard too many people have good things to say when private equity comes into any business. They cut expenses and they increase income, and then they try to sell and get out.
Yeah.
So that's another thing. Like, how is this company like, hey, I'm here. I'm doing this because, I like real estate and this is a part of my business and I've been here a long time? Or is it one of those that's like, hey, I'm doing this because I've got in a different industry and this, I bought into this franchise, for example, and I'm going to try to sell this at some point, or I'm going to own multiple franchises. I just think you have to see kind of what your flavor is and how that experience is with people. We get some clients, Daniel, from folks who they call in and they're like, wow, you guys are knowledgeable. I was talking to somebody, nothing against RTMs or remote team members or international folks, but they're talking to somebody elsewhere that doesn't understand the business or understand Houston or their market. And it's just, you're a number. You're not going to have a point of contact. It's like calling into a call center and you're going to get routed all over the world. So I think from the beginning of that relationship, from the beginning of that phone call, understanding and trying to get a gauge of what is this company like?
I think at the end of the day, people who are listening to this right now are interested in financial freedom. They're not looking to create a new job, right? It's not like they're trying to replace one job with another job necessarily. They're hoping for something really passive. So you've been through the trenches. You've learned a lot. You've seen where it goes wrong. Where are people getting burned the most when it comes to the passive nature of what they're looking to accomplish? And are there kind of red flags that you've seen that like, whoa, if I paid attention to that, maybe I could have avoided an expensive mistake? What type of learnings have you kind of gotten through the years here?
I think tenant selection and tenant screening is the most important. Upstream of that would be what I mentioned just briefly earlier, is making sure you buy a desirable property. Over the past 15 years, ever since the great financial crisis, we've been in a supply shortage of homes. So you could put lipstick on a pig. You had no problem getting tenants. You would put out an application or put out the property for rent and get 50 applications. And you're sorting through people with great incomes, great credit scores, and you're rocking and rolling. It's not that easy now. If anybody who's listening to this, that in 2026, ever really since 23, maybe 24 has experienced this. It's national data, but it's also, I mean, in most metro markets, things are slowing down. Rents are compressing. It's getting more competitive. And so when supply comes up, there's more competition. So how is your property going to stand out? And I made mistakes of buying a couple properties way outside of Houston because they were a good deal. And yeah, I bought them for 50 cents on the dollar, but we've had all this appreciation over the past 6-7 years, amazing appreciation. And those properties maybe went up $20,000, $30,000. Whereas I have other properties in better parts of town that have gone up $100,000, $150,000. So, oh yeah, this property outside of Houston, an hour, has great cash flow. The ROI, when you look at your cash on cash return, it's great, but you're only making $150 a month, and you're netted out with maybe $30,000, $40,000 of equity gain. Whereas maybe you only made $100 a month on this property that's a little bit nicer, that's more expensive. But over the last 5-10 years, I've made a 6-figure payday. And I get it, until you sell, asset prices have kind of stabilized or come down slightly. But still, I did not appreciate appreciation when I first started. And I was all like, how do I get out of this W-2 job and make sure that the next oil crash isn't going to wipe me out? So I was hyper fixated on that, Daniel. And I think if I keep doing this for another few years and own these properties that I do, I would say it's going to cost me 7 figures, because I passed on a lot of properties that didn't cash flow. And if I owned half of those now, I'm imagining in the next few years, it literally will be a 7-figure mistake.
I think appreciation is something a lot of us miss. Like, we're not thinking about that. We're thinking about just the cash flow. That's really insightful. I mentioned earlier, it is a partnership. Assuming you find the best property manager and you're really happy with how that's going and things are working for you, what is a good property manager looking from the landlord that they're partnered with? How do you keep that property manager that you fought so hard to find?
You know, I missed one of your other questions. I glazed over it there about how property managers get this bad rap, because it's about expectations. When you go buy a Toyota and you know what you're getting, it's a great car, but it's not an Escalade. It doesn't have all these bells and whistles. So you've got to make sure that what you're spending your money on and what you're getting is meeting what you need or what you are expecting to get. So I think that's one of them. It's, well, I'm just going to hire a property manager and they'll do everything I say, or it's a full service company like we are. And they're like, well, I want to do this piece of it, or I want to do that piece. And that's where, expectations get missed. And it's like, hey, listen, we have a very robust system that we've developed over thousands of tenants. And some of this stuff you can do with a lease agent, but for us, it's violation of fair housing. I don't know how many times I've heard, like, I don't want any pets in my property. I've heard, I don't want kids in my property. And I'm like, hey, listen, no big deal on the pet thing. However, what happens when you have an ESA or service animal? Because those are not subject to any sort of pet policy. We've all seen those little memes of the emotional support donkey and stuff. You can't do anything about that. So you might as well allow pets. With 80% of tenants having pets, you are eliminating a huge part of the market. And I get it. I've heard this once, Daniel. It said, care does not equal competence. And so I really care about my rental property. I really, really care. But that doesn't mean that I'm competent in understanding how that works. If I'm sending my mom in to get some surgery, I care a lot, but I'm not the one who's best to perform that surgery. That's the professional. And I think property managers for so long have got a bad rap about just being a dude in a truck with a hammer. And I'll go out and I'll fix what I fix and I'll take care of stuff and I'll put a sign in the yard and I'll respond to phone calls. But I feel like we get that kind of like blue collar mentality or blue collar stigma. And really true property management that's asset management based is more of this is a business. And I think people treat their rental properties like hobbies, and they want to be involved and they're like, okay, this is my thing. But to manage it like a true asset, like a financial advisor, sometimes, again, you think that you know best when really, and I'm not saying all property managers know best. There are some out there that are horrendous, but that I think is another thing. I think people care so much. I get it. It might be their largest investment, but it doesn't always equal that they know what's best. So setting expectations, make sure that you find a good property manager. And then the stigma that we get is because there are real estate agents or just handymen that say, yeah, I can do property management, especially in these states that don't require any licensing. I mean, today you could create a business card in certain states and just say, I'm a property manager. Put your name out on Thumbtack or, create a Google My Business profile and none the wiser. So I think that's another thing, is making sure that kind of goes back to that experience piece. They've been in this, they cut their teeth for about 10 years or more. I think they're probably a safe bet that they know what works and what doesn't, because I've seen those folks, Daniel, they get a real estate agent like, well, this guy's going to do it for 1%, or 0.5% or something like that. And they're new and they're young and they're ambitious and they're answering all your phone calls. But with people who have 1 or 2 properties, I just don't recommend going that route. Go with the experienced person because you don't know what you don't know yet. And it might sound like, okay, I'm going to save some money on this, or go with the cheap property manager who's going to charge you $49 or $59 property management, and they're going to save me money. But
are they?
Exactly. One big mistake or one thing that they're going to say, Daniel, what do you think? It's like, well, hold on. You're the professional. I work at Google or I work at BP. I don't know. So I think that's another thing, is just that's where the stigma comes in. In a deregulated market, anybody can raise their hand and say they're a property manager. So I think that's where, again, we go back to the making sure you have multiple years of experience. So that person has cut their teeth and learned from their mistakes.
Yeah, I've heard horror stories of people saying that I tried to work with a property manager. I wish I'd never done it because all they did was call me and pass every issue. It's like playing telephone. It was like the tenant would call them and they'd call me, and I just had to make all the decisions, and I had to just open up my wallet and just do everything. I was like, what are they doing for me? Well, of course, they found the cheapest person they could find who was just passing the buck along. So I think that's great advice, because like your goal is, if you don't want to take it on yourself, you need to pay someone who actually knows how to do it themselves and have that experience. So Cameron, this has been great. I know we could go deeper here. I have all kinds of thoughts around like taxes and operations and like scale up and all kinds of stuff. But you've been very generous with your time here. I would love for you to give the listeners a chance to know how to connect with you and how to learn more about Emerson Property Management as well.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Daniel. Yeah, it flew by, man. It's a great conversation. The easiest place is just emersonpropertymanagement.com. We'll have our socials on there and whatnot. I've been doing YouTube videos to help educate investors, just small mom and pop landlords, for 7 or 8 years. So there's a lot of good free content on there. And on our website, we have a lot of great free things. If you are in the market right now, we're seeing a lot of accidental landlords come in, which are people that are trying to sell and then couldn't sell because of that supply glut I was talking about. So we created an accidental landlord starter kit. So if you go into emersonpropertymanagement.com/accidental, you'll find a bunch of free content. I really do believe that you'll know more than most single family managers and some property managers by just having that free guide.
Thanks again, Cameron, for coming on the show. And I appreciate you sharing all of your wisdom and insight on something that a lot of us always think about, but we're not too sure about until we go through it. So thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely, Daniel. Thank you.
I own one rental property. It's in a college town, 3 hours away from my house, and I decided I would manage it myself. After half a year of research, we found a property that we thought would have good cash flow. And I made my own lease agreement that complied to Washington state laws. I made sure it went through inspection, and I fixed it up to make sure that it was rent ready. Then I advertised and I screened tenants, and I set up all the means necessary to legally collect rent. And it all worked. I was able to get tenants moved in. I collected the security deposits, and finally, the first rent. It was actually very exciting. It was real passive income coming from something other than stocks. But the call that came after was the one that I didn't expect. Even after doing everything I thought was right, I received a phone call from the tenant that the oven didn't work. I had just paid for an inspection. It was 3 hours just to get there. I'd probably walk in, take a look, diagnose it, see if there's a problem, and maybe replace it on the spot. Instead of that, I hesitated, and I realized, okay, what would a property manager do in this scenario? And I asked the tenant to check a few things and send me some photos. And it turned out that the oven wasn't plugged in all the way. Problem solved, just in a few minutes. But I earned that outcome not with a system. I earned it by luck. If I had paid for someone who had a playbook in place, they would have just done that by default and may not have even heard about it. But for me, I realized that I needed to have my own playbooks and system in place because this was now my responsibility. And the gap between luck and system is what this episode is really all about. If you don't have a property manager, you are the property manager. The work will always exist. Rent ready prep, marketing, screening, tenant relations, maintenance, move out, and then the most litigious step in the whole cycle, collecting security deposit and rents. And the only question is, who does that work? And how well do they do it? And this is where rentals quietly betray people chasing financial independence. Because real estate can have this long feedback loop. If you were to bake a cake, you'd know within an hour if you screwed it up or not. But when you're screening a tenant badly, You could go months feeling like you didn't do anything wrong, that you're a genius, that everything's going to go great, right until that moment where you find out that you had made a mistake. And then it's often way too late. And caring deeply doesn't close that gap. Care does not equal competence. We clearly all care about these expensive assets and we want to do well by them. For instance, like Cameron said, he cares about his mother, but he would not want to be the one trying to perform her surgery. So whether you hire out someone or run it yourself, the operation lives or dies in 3 places, and I'll recap them. First was tenant selection. Cameron shared that over 9 out of 10 evictions that his company processes traces back to tenants the owners placed themselves, before professional screening ever touched the file. That was not a pitch for his firm. It was evidence that screening is a technical skill with real tools behind it, and that getting it wrong is the single most expensive mistake in his business. Houston area landlords alone filed 77,000 eviction cases in 2025. Next, it's speed. A vacant property bleeds roughly $100 a day in lost rent, utilities, and risk. So, run turnovers on a clock. Line up the make-ready before the tenant is gone, mark it within days of move-out, and never spend a month evaluating your options while the meter's running. Last, but certainly not least, is maintenance. It's the number one reason tenants leave, and it cuts both ways. Fast responses keep good tenants, and smart triage kills the third of work orders that turn out to be unplugged toasters or a breaker that just needed to be flipped. My oven story wasn't unique. It's actually quite common. And if you do hire out, remember there are plenty of states a business card is the only credential required. Look for a decade or more of experience, real local knowledge instead of a call center, and know who you're actually partnering with. Because private equity is rolling up management companies, and the relationship you sign can just vanish in an acquisition. There's a reason the share of owners who hire a manager specifically to stay compliant has jumped from 21% in 2021 to 33% today. But there was one lesson that surprised me the most. In my conversation with Cameron, he had one big regret, and it had nothing to do with operations. Cameron's biggest regret was buying only for cash flow. He was so focused on escaping his W-2 that he passed up on better properties and better locations. Those cheap houses that he was able to get did have gains, but usually around $20,000 or $30,000 or so. And the ones he passed on, though, they had gains of $150,000 or more. He calls it his 7-figure mistake. So cash flow, it keeps you in the game, but appreciation is where the wealth can compound. And ideally, we would like to underwrite both. If there's a big takeaway for your program today, let it be this. We escape the clock by building assets that pay us without consuming us. And a rental only qualifies if the operation underneath it is handled by you with your eyes open or by a professional you vetted, like your freedom depends on it, because it does. Passive isn't a property type. It's an operating decision. I'd love to hear from you. Are you self-managing or have you hired out? And what pushed you one way or the other? Email me at contact@escapetheclock.com or leave a comment wherever you listen. I'm Daniel C. Rogers. Thanks for listening, and best of luck building rentals that work for you and escaping the clock. I'll catch you next time.
That's a wrap on this episode of Escape the Clock. Everything you've heard today is for educational purposes only, designed to help you think, plan, and build a stronger financial program. Take what resonates, bring it into your Escape the Clock plan, and review it with a qualified professional before making any major moves. I'm Daniel C. Rogers, a wealth management certified professional and your host. The book, the free planner, and the one-on-one time with me are all waiting for you at EscapeTheClock.com. If this episode was valuable, please leave a rating, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'll catch you next week.